The Christmas after Ben became 3 only partly filled the house. A cousin of David's had said, "I've been inspired by you, Harriet. After all, I've got a home too. It's not as big as yours, but it's a nice little house." Several of the family went there, but others said they were coming, made a point of coming, Harriet realized. These were the near relations. Again a pet was brought. This time it was a big dog, a cheerful, boisterous mongrel, Sarah's children's friend, but most particularly Amy's. Of course, all the children loved him, but Paul most of all, and this made Harriet's heart ache, for they could have no dog or cat in their home. She even thought, well, now Ben is more sensible, perhaps. But she knew it was impossible. She watched how the big dog seemed to know that Amy, the loving little child in the big ugly body, needed gentleness. He moderated his exuberance for her. Amy would sit by the dog with her arm around his neck, and if she was clumsy with him, he lifted his muzzle and gently pushed her away a little, or gave a small warning sound that said, "Be careful." Sarah said this dog was like a nursemaid to Amy. Just like Nana in Peter Pan, the children said. But if Ben was in the room, the dog watched him carefully and went to lie in a corner, his head on his paws, stiff with attention. One morning when people were sitting around having breakfast, Harriet for some reason turned her head and saw the dog, asleep, and Ben going silently up to him in a low crouch, hands held out in front of him. "Ben," said Harriet sharply. She saw those cold eyes turn towards her, caught a gleam of pure malice. The dog, alerted, scrambled up and his hair stood on end. He whined anxiously and came into the part of the room where they all were and lay down under the table. Everyone had seen this and sat silent, while Ben came to Dorothy and said, "I want milk." She poured him some, and he drank it down. Then he looked at them all staring at him. Again he seemed to be trying to understand them. He went into the garden, where they could see him, a squat little gnome, poking with a stick at the earth. The other children were upstairs somewhere. Around the table sat Dorothy, with Amy on her lap, Sarah, Molly, Frederick, James, and David. Also Angela, the successful sister, the Coper, whose children were all normal. The atmosphere made Harriet say defiantly, "All right then, let's have it." She thought it not without significance, as they say, that it was Frederick who said, "Now look here, Harriet, you've got to face it. He's got to go into an institution." "Then we have to find a doctor who says he's abnormal," said Harriet. "Dr. Brett certainly won't." "Get another doctor," said Molly. "These things can be arranged." The two large haystacky people, with their red well-fed faces, were united in determination. Nothing vague about them now. They had decided there was a crisis, and one that, even indirectly, threatened them. They looked like a pair of judges after a good lunch, Harriet thought, and glanced at David to see if she could share this criticism with him, but he was staring down at the table, mouth tight. He agreed with them. Angela said, laughing, typical upper-class ruthlessness. No one could remember that note being struck, or at least not so sharply, at this table before. Silence, and then Angela softened it with, "Not that I don't agree." "Of course you agree," said Molly. "Anyone sensible would have to." "It's the way you said it," said Angela. "What does it matter how it is said?" inquired Frederick. "And who is going to pay for it?" asked David. "I can't. All I can do is to keep the bills paid, and that is with James's help." "Well, James is going to have to bear the brunt of this one," said Frederick, "but we'll chip in." It was the first time this couple had offered any financial help. Like all their sort, the rest of the family had agreed, and now this judgment was being remembered. They would come for a stay of 10 days and contribute a pair of pheasants, a couple of bottles of very good wine. Their chipping in, everyone knew, wouldn't amount to much. Full of division, the family sat silent. Then James said, "I'll do what I can. But things are not as good as they were. Yachts are not everyone's priority in hard times." Silence again, and everyone was looking at Harriet. "You are funny people," she said, setting herself apart from them. "You've been here so often and you really know what the problem is." "What are we going to say to the people who run this institution?" "It depends on the institution," said Molly, and her large person seemed full of energy, conviction, as if she had swallowed Ben whole and was digesting him, thought Harriet. She said, mildly enough, though she trembled. You mean, we have to find one of those places that exist in order to take on children families simply want to get rid of? Rich families, said Angela, with a defiant little sniff. Molly, confronting impertinence, said firmly, yes. If there is no other kind of place. But one thing is obvious. If something isn't done, then it's going to be catastrophic. It is catastrophic, said Dorothy, firmly taking her position. The other children, they're suffering. You're so involved with it, girl, that you don't see it. Look, said David, impatient and angry because he could not stand this. Fibers tangled with Harriet, with his parents, being tugged and torn. Look, I agree. And sometime Harriet is going to have to agree. And as far as I am concerned, that time is now. I don't think I can stick it any longer. And now he did look at his wife, and it was a pleading, suffering look. Please, he was saying to Harriet. Please. Very well, said Harriet. If someplace can be found that. And she began to cry. Ben came in from the garden and stood watching them in his usual position, which was apart from everyone else. He wore brown dungarees and a brown shirt, both in strong material. Everything he wore had to be thick, because he tore his clothes, destroyed them. With his yellowish, stubbly, low-growing hair, his stony, unblinking eyes, his stoop, his feet planted apart and his knees bent, his clenched, held-forward fists, he seemed more than ever like a gnome. She is crying, he remarked of his mother. He took a piece of bread off the table and went out. All right, said Harriet. What are you going to tell them? Leave it to us, said Frederick. Yes, said Molly. My God, said Angela, with a kind of bitter appreciation of them. Sometimes when I'm with you, I understand everything about this country. Thank you, said Molly. Thank you, said Frederick. You aren't being fair, girl, said Dorothy. Fair, said Angela and Harriet and Sarah, her daughters, almost all at once. And then everyone but Harriet laughed. In this way was Ben's fate decided. A few days later, Frederick rang to say that a place had been found and a car was coming for Ben. At once. Tomorrow. Harriet was frantic. The haste of it, the ruthlessness. And the doctor who had authorized this? Or would? A doctor who had not even seen Ben? She said all this to David, and knew from his manner that a good deal had gone on behind her back. His parents had talked to him at his office. David had said something like, yes, I'll see to it, when Molly, whom suddenly Harriet hated, had said, you'll have to be firm with Harriet. It's either him or us, said David to Harriet. He added, his voice full of cold dislike for Ben, he's probably just dropped in from Mars. He's going back to report on what he's found down here. He laughed, cruelly, it seemed to Harriet, who was silently taking in the fact, which of course she had half known already, that Ben was not expected to live long in this institution, whatever it was. He's a little child, she said. He's our child. No, he's not, said David, finally. Well, he certainly isn't mine. They were in the living room. Children's voices rose sharp and distant from the dark winter garden. On the same impulse, David and Harriet went to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains. The garden held dim shapes of tree and shrub, but the light from this warm room reached across the lawn to a shrub that was starkly black with winter, lit twiggy growths that showed a glitter of water, and illuminated the white trunk of a birch. Two small figures, indistinguishably unisex in their many-colored padded jackets, trousers, woolen caps, emerged from the black under a holly thicket and came forward. They were Helen and Luke, on some adventure. Both held sticks and were prodding them here and there into last year's leaves. Here it is. Helen's voice rose in triumph, and the parents saw, emerging into the light on the end of the stick, the summer's lost red and yellow plastic ball. It was dirted and squashed, but whole. The two children began a fast stamping dance around and around, the rescued ball held aloft in triumph. Then, suddenly, for no obvious reason, they came racing up to the French doors. The parents sat down on a sofa, facing the doors, which burst inwards, and there they were, two slight, elegant little creatures, with flaring red, frost-burned cheeks and eyes full of the excitements of the dark wilderness they had been part of. They stood breathing heavily, their eyes slowly adjusting to reality, the warm, lit family room and their parents sitting there looking at them. For a moment, it was the meeting of two alien forms of life. The children had been part of some old savagery, and their blood still pounded with it, but now they had to let their wild selves go away while they rejoined their family. Harriet and David shared this with them, were with them in imagination and in memory. From their own childhoods, they could see themselves clearly, two adults, sitting there, tame, domestic, even pitiable in their distance from wildness and freedom. Seeing their parents there alone, no other children around, and above all, no Ben, Helen came to her father, Luke to his mother, and Harriet and David embraced their two adventurous little children, their children, holding them tight. Next morning the car, which was a small black van, came for Ben. Harriet had known it was coming because David had not gone to work. He had stayed so as to handle her. David went upstairs and brought down suitcases and holdalls that he had packed quietly while she was giving the children breakfast. He flung these into the van. Then, his face set hard, so that Harriet hardly knew him. He picked Ben up from where he sat on the floor in the living room, carried him to the van, and put him in. Then he came fast to Harriet with the same hard-set face and put his arm around her, turned her away from the side of the van, which was already on its way. She could hear yells and shouts coming from inside it, and took her to the sofa, where, still holding her tight, he said, over and over again, "We have to do it, Harriet. We have to." She was weeping with the shock of it, and with relief, and with gratitude to him, who was taking all the responsibility. When the children came home, they were told Ben had gone to stay with someone. "With Granny?" asked Helen, anxious. "No." For pairs of suspicious, apprehensive eyes became suddenly full of relief. Hysterical relief. The children danced about, unable to help themselves, and then pretended it was a game they had thought up then and there. At supper they were overbright, giggling, hysterical. But in a quiet moment Jane asked shrilly, "Are you going to send us away, too?" She was a stolid, quiet little girl, Dorothy in miniature, never saying anything unnecessary. But now her large blue eyes were fixed in terror on her mother's face. "No, of course we aren't," said David, sounding curt. Luke explained, "They are sending Ben away because he isn't really one of us." In the days that followed, the family expanded like paper flowers in water. Harriet understood what a burden Ben had been, how he had oppressed them all, how much the children had suffered, knew that they had talked about it much more than the parents had wanted to know, had tried to come to terms with Ben. But now Ben was gone, their eyes shone. They were full of high spirits, and they kept coming to Harriet with little gifts of a sweet or a toy. "This is for you, Mummy." Or they rushed up to kiss her, or stroke her face, or nuzzle to her like happy calves or foals. And David took days off from work to be with them all, to be with her. He was careful with her, tender. "As if I were ill," she decided rebelliously. Of course she thought all the time of Ben, who was a prisoner somewhere. What kind of a prisoner? She pictured the little black van, remembered his cries of rage as he was taken away. The days went by, and normality filled the house. Harriet heard the children talking about the Easter holidays. "It will be all right now that Ben isn't here," said Helen. They had always understood so much more than she had wanted to acknowledge. While she was part of the general relief, and could hardly believe she had been able to stand such strain, and for so long, she could not banish Ben from her mind. It was not with love, or even affection, that she thought of him, and she disliked herself for not being able to find one little spark of normal feeling. It was guilt and horror that kept her awake through the nights. David knew she was awake, though she did try to hide it. Then one morning she started up out of sleep, out of a bad dream, though she did not know what, and she said, "I'm going to see what they are doing to Ben." David opened his eyes and lay silent, staring over his arm at the window. He had been dozing, not asleep. She knew he had feared this, and there was something about him then that said to her, "Right, then that's it, it's enough." "David, I've got to." "Don't," he said. "I simply have to." Again she knew from the way he lay there, not looking at her, and did not say anything more than that one syllable, that it was bad for her, that he was making decisions as he lay there. He stayed where he was for a few minutes, and then got out of bed, and went out of the room and downstairs. When she had got her clothes on, she rang Molly, who was at once coldly angry. No, I'm not going to tell you where it is. Now you've done it, then leave it alone. But at last she did give Harriet the address. Again, Harriet was wondering why she was always treated like a criminal. Ever since Ben was born, it's been like this, she thought. Now it seemed to her the truth, that everyone had silently condemned her. I have suffered a misfortune, she told herself. I haven't committed a crime. Ben had been taken to a place in the north of England. It would be 4 or 5 hours' drive, perhaps more, if she was unlucky with the traffic. There was bad traffic, and she drove through gray wintry rain. It was early afternoon when she approached a large solid building of dark stone. In a valley high among moors she could hardly see for gray drifting rain. The place stood square and upright among dismal dripping evergreens, and its regular windows, 3 rows of them, were barred. She entered a small entrance lobby that had a handwritten card tacked on the inner door, "Ring for attendance." She rang and waited, and nothing happened. Her heart was beating. She still surged with the adrenaline that had given her the impetus to come, but the long drive had subdued her, and this oppressive building was telling her nerves, if not her intelligence, for, after all, she had no facts to go on. That what she had feared was true. Yet she did not know exactly what that was. She rang again. The building was silent. She could hear the shrill of a bell a long way off in its interior. Again, nothing, and she was about to go around to the back when the door abruptly opened to show a slatternly girl wearing jerseys, cardigans, and a thick scarf. She had a pale little face under a mass of curly yellow hair that had a blue ribbon holding a queue like a sheep's tail. She seemed tired. "Yes?" she asked. Harriet saw, understanding what this meant, that people simply did not come here. She said, already stubborn, "I'm Mrs. Lovett, and I've come to see my son." It was evident that these were words this institution, whatever it was, did not expect to meet. The girl stared, gave an involuntary little shake of the head that expressed incapacity, and then said, "Dr. Macpherson isn't here this week." She was Scottish, too, and her accent was strong. "Someone must be deputizing for him," said Harriet decisively. The girl fell back before Harriet's manner, smiling uncertainly and very worried. She muttered, "Wait here," then, and went inside. Harriet followed her before the big door was shut to exclude her. The girl did glance around, as if she planned to say, "You must wait outside," but instead she said, "I'll fetch someone," and went on into the dark caverns of a corridor that had small ceiling lights all along it, hardly disturbing the gloom. There was a smell of disinfectant. Absolute silence. No, after a time Harriet became aware of a high-thin screaming that began, and stopped, and went on again, coming from the back of the building. Nothing happened. Harriet went out into the vestibule, which was already darkening with the approaching night. The rain was now a cold deluge, silent and regular. The moors had disappeared. She rang again, decisively, and returned to the corridor. 2 figures appeared, a long way off under the pinpoints of the ceiling lights, and came towards her. A young man, in a white coat that was not clean, was followed by the girl, who now had a cigarette in her mouth and was screwing up her eyes from the smoke. Both looked tired and uncertain. He was an ordinary young man, though worn down in a general way, taken bit by bit, hands, face, eyes. He was unremarkable, but there was something desperate about him, as if he contained anger or hopelessness. "You can't be here," he said, in a flurried, indecisive way. "We don't have visiting days here." His voice was South London, flat and nasal. "But I am here," said Harriet. "I am here to see my son Ben Lovett." And suddenly he took in a breath and looked at the girl, who pursed her lips together and raised her eyebrows. "Listen," said Harriet. "I don't think you understand. I'm not just going away, you know. I've come to see my son, and that is what I am going to do." He knew she meant it. He slowly nodded, as if saying yes, but that isn't the point. He was looking hard at her. She was being given a warning, and from someone who was taking the responsibility for it. He might be a rather pitiable young man, and certainly an overtired and inadequately fed one, doing this job because he could not get another, but the weight of his position, the unhappy weight of it, was speaking through him, and his expression and his reddened, Smoke-tired eyes were severe, authoritative, to be taken seriously. When people dump their kids here, they don't come and see them after, he said. You see, you don't understand at all, said the girl. Harriet heard herself explode with, I'm sick of being told I don't understand this and that. I'm the child's mother. I'm Ben Lovett's mother. Do you understand that? Suddenly they were all three together in understanding, even in desperate acceptance of some kind of general fatality. He nodded and said, Well, I'll go and see. And I am coming too, she said. This really did alert him. Oh no, he exclaimed, you're not. He said something to the girl, who began running surprisingly fast down the corridor. You stay here, he said to Harriet, and strode after the girl. Harriet saw the girl turn right and disappear, and without thinking she opened a door at her right hand. She saw the young man's arm raised in imprecation or warning, while what was behind that door reached her. She was at the end of a long ward, which had any number of cots and beds along the walls. In the cots were monsters. While she strode rapidly through the ward to the door at the other end, she was able to see that every bed or cot held an infant or small child in whom the human template had been wrenched out of pattern, sometimes horribly, sometimes slightly. A baby like a comma, great lolling head on a stalk of a body, then something like a stick insect, enormous bulging eyes among stiff fragilities that were limbs, a small girl all blurred, her flesh guttering and melting, a doll with chalky swollen limbs. Its eyes wide and blank, like blue ponds, and its mouth open, showing a swollen little tongue. A lanky boy was skewed, one half of his body sliding from the other. A child seemed at first glance normal, but then Harriet saw there was no back to its head. It was all face, which seemed to scream at her. Rows of freaks, nearly all asleep, and all silent. They were literally drugged out of their minds. Well, nearly silent. There was a dreary sobbing from a cot that had its sides shielded with blankets. The high intermittent screaming, nearer now, still assaulted her nerves. A smell of excrement, stronger than the disinfectant. Then she was out of the nightmare ward and in another corridor, parallel to the one she had first seen and identical. At its end she saw the girl, followed by the young man, come a little way towards her and then again turn right. Harriet ran fast, hearing her feet thud on the boards, and turned where they did, and was in a tiny room holding trolleys of medicines and drugs. She ran through this, and was now in a long cement-floored passage that had doors with inspection grills in them all along the wall facing her. The young man and the girl were opening one of these doors as she arrived beside them. All three were breathing heavily. Shit, said the young man, meeting her being there. Literally, said Harriet as the door opened on a square room whose walls were of white shiny plastic that was buttoned here and there and looked like fake expensive leather upholstery. On the floor, on a green foam rubber mattress, lay Ben. He was unconscious. He was naked, inside a straitjacket. His pale yellow tongue protruded from his mouth. His flesh was dead white greenish. Everything, walls, the floor, and Ben, was smeared with excrement. A pool of dark yellow urine oozed from the pallet, which was soaked. I told you not to come, shouted the young man. He took Ben's shoulders and the girl Ben's feet. From the way they touched the child, Harriet saw they were not brutal. That was not the point at all. They lifted Ben thus, for in this way they had to touch very little of him, out of this room, along the corridor a little way, and through another door. She followed and stood watching. This was a room that had sinks all along one wall, an immense bath, and a sloping cement shelf with plugs all along it. They put Ben on the shelf, unwound the straitjacket, and, having adjusted the temperature of the water, began washing him down with a hose that was attached to one of the taps. Harriet leaned against the wall, watching. She was shocked to the point where she felt nothing at all. Ben did not move. He lay like a drowned fish on the slab, was turned over several times by the girl, when the young man interrupted the hosing process for the purpose and was finally carried by them both to another slab, where they dried him and then took a clean straitjacket from a pile and put it on him. Why? Demanded Harriet fierce. They did not answer. They took the child, trussed, unconscious, his tongue lolling, out of the room, down the corridor and into another room that had a cement shelf like a bed in it. They put Ben on it, and then both stood up and sighed, "Phew." "Well, there he is," said the young man. He stood for a moment, eyes closed, recovering from the ordeal, and then lit a cigarette. The girl put out her hand for one. He gave it to her. They stood smoking, looking at Harriet in an exhausted, defeated way. She did not know what to say. Her heart was hurting as it would for one of her own, real children, for Ben looked more ordinary than she had ever seen him, with those hard, cold, alien eyes of his closed. Pathetic. She had never seen him as pathetic before. "I think I'll take him home," she said. "It's up to you," said the young man shortly. The girl was looking curiously at Harriet, as if she were part of the phenomenon that was Ben, of the same nature. She asked, "What are you going to do with him?" She added, and Harriet recognized fear in her voice, "He's so strong. I've never seen anything like it." "None of us have seen anything like it," said the young man. "Where are his clothes?" Now he laughed, scornful, and said, "You're going to put his clothes on and take him home, just like that? Why not? He was wearing clothes when he came." The two attendants, nurses, orderlies, whatever they were, exchanged looks. Then both took a drag on their cigarettes. He said, "I don't think you understand, Mrs. Lovett. How far have you got to go, for a start? 4 or 5 hours driving." He laughed again at the impossibility of it, of her, Harriet, and said, "He's going to come round on the journey, and then what?" "Well, he'll see me," she said, and saw from their faces that she was being stupid. "All right then, what do you advise?" "Wrap him in a couple of blankets, over the straitjacket," said the girl. "And then drive like hell," he said. The three now stood in silence, looking at each other, a long, sober look. "You try doing this job," said the girl suddenly, full of rage against fate. "You just try it." "Well, I'm leaving at the end of this month." "And so am I. No one sticks it longer than a few weeks," said the man. "All right," said Harriet. "I'm not going to complain or anything. You'll have to sign a form." "We have to be covered," he said. But they could not easily find the form. At last, after a lot of rummaging about in a filing cabinet, they produced a slip of paper, mimeographed years ago, that said Harriet acquitted the institution of all responsibility. Now she picked Ben up, touching him for the first time. He was deadly cold. He lay heavy in her arms, and she understood the words a dead weight. She went out into the corridor, saying, "I'm not going through that ward again." "Who could blame you?" said the young man, wearily sarcastic. He had got hold of a load of blankets, and they wrapped Ben in two, carried him out to the car, laid him on the back seat, and piled more blankets over him. Only his face showed. She stood with the two young people by the car. They could hardly see each other. Apart from the car lights and the lights of the building, it was dark. Water squelched underfoot. The young man took out of his overall pocket a plastic package containing a syringe, a couple of needles, and some ampoules. "You had better take these," he said. Harriet hesitated, and the girl said, "Mrs. Lovett, I don't think you realize." She nodded, took the package, got in. "You can give him up to 4 shots a day, not more," said the young man. As she was about to let the clutch pedal out, she asked, "Tell me, how long do you think he would have lasted?" Their faces were white patches in the gloom, but she could see that he shook his head, turning away. The girl's voice came, "None of them last long. But this one, he's very strong. He's the strongest any of us have seen." "Which means he would have lasted longer." "No," he said. "No, that's not it at all. Because he's so strong, he fights all the time, and so he has to have bigger shots. It kills them." "All right," said Harriet. "Well, thank you both." They stood watching as she drove off, but almost at once vanished into the wet dark. As she rounded the drive, she saw them standing in the dimly lit porch, close together, as if reluctant to go in. She drove as fast as she could through the wintry rain, avoiding the main roads, keeping an eye on the heap of blankets behind her. About halfway home, she saw the blankets heave and convulse, and Ben woke with a bellow of rage and thrashed about, landing on the floor of the car, where he began to scream. Not like the thin, high automatic screaming she had heard at the institution, but screams of fear that vibrated through her. She stuck it out for half an hour, feeling the thuds that Ben made vibrate through the car. She was looking for a lay-by that had no other car in it, and when she found one, she stopped, let the engine run, and took out the syringe. She knew how to use it from some illness of the other children. She broke open the capsule, which had no brand name on it, and filled the syringe. Then she leaned over the back of the seat. Ben, naked except for the straitjacket and blue with cold, was heaving and struggling and bellowing. His eyes looked up at her in a glare of hate. He didn't recognize her, she thought. She did not dare unwind the jacket. She was afraid of injecting him anywhere near his neck. At last she managed to grab and hold an ankle, jabbed the needle into the lower part of his calf, and waited until he went limp. It took a few moments. What was this stuff? Again, she put him on the back seat under the blankets, and now she drove on the main roads home. She got there at about 8. The children would be sitting around the kitchen table. And David would be with them. He would not have gone to work. With Ben a mound of blankets in her arms, his face covered, she went into the living room and looked over the low wall to where they all sat around the big table. Luke, Helen, Jane, little Paul, and David, his face set and angry, and very tired. She remarked they were killing him and saw that David would not forgive her for saying this in front of the children. All showed fear. She went straight up the stairs to the big bedroom and through it to the baby's room and put Ben on the bed. He was waking up. And then it began, the fighting, the heaving, the screaming. Again he was on the floor, rolling around on it, and again he flexed and bent and thrashed, and his eyes were pure hate. She could not take off the straitjacket. She went down into the kitchen and got milk and biscuits while her family sat and watched her in total silence. Ben's screams and struggling were shaking the house. "The police will be here," said David. "Keep them quiet," she commanded, and went up with the food. When Ben saw what she held, he became silent and still, and his eyes were avid. She lifted him like a mummy, put the cup of milk to his lips, and he almost drowned as he gulped. He was starving. She fed him bits of biscuit, keeping her fingers clear of his teeth. When what she had brought was finished, he began roaring and flailing again. She gave him another jab. The children were in front of the television, but were not watching it. Jane and Paul were crying. David sat at the table with his head in his hands. She said softly, for him to hear, "All right, I am a criminal." But they were murdering him. He did not move. She had her back to him. She did not want to see his face. She said he would have been dead in a few months. Weeks, probably. A silence. At last she turned. She could hardly bear to look at him. He looked ill, but that was not it. She said, "I couldn't stand it." He said deliberately, "I thought that was the idea." She cried out, "Yes, but you didn't see it, you didn't see." "I was careful not to see," he said. "What did you suppose was going to happen? That they were going to turn him into some well-adjusted member of society, and then everything would be lovely." He was jeering at her, but it was because his throat was stiff with tears. Now they looked at each other, long, hard, seeing everything about each other. She thought, "All right, he was right, and I was wrong. But it's done." She said aloud, "All right, but it's done." She sat down beside the children on the sofa. Now she saw they all had tear-stained faces. She could not touch them to comfort them, because it was she who made them cry. When she at last said bed, they all got up at once and went, without looking at her. She took supplies of suitable food for Ben up to the big bedroom. David had moved his things to another room. When Ben woke towards morning and began his roaring, she fed him and drugged him. She gave the children breakfast as always and tried to be normal. They tried too. No one mentioned Ben. When David came down, she said, "Please take them to school." Then the house had only her and Ben in it. When he woke, she fed him but did not drug him. He roared and struggled, but she thought much less. In a lull, when he seemed worn out, she said, "Ben, you're at home, not in that place." He was listening. "When you stop making all that noise, I'll take you out of that thing they put you in." It was too soon. He began struggling again. Through his screams, she heard voices and went to the banisters. David had not gone to his office, had stayed home to help her. Two young policewomen stood there, and David was talking to them. They went away. What had they been told? She did not ask. Towards the time the children were due home, she said to Ben, "I want you to be quiet now, Ben. The other children will be here and you'll frighten them screaming like that." He became quiet. It was exhaustion. He was on the floor, which was by now streaked with excrement. She carried him to the bathroom, took off the jacket, put him in the bath and washed him, and saw that he was shuddering with terror. He had not always been unconscious when they washed him in that place. She took him back to the bed and said, "If you start all that again, then I'm going to have to put that thing back on you." He ground his teeth at her, his eyes blazing. But he was afraid, too. She was going to have to control him through fear. She cleaned his room while he lay moving his arms about, as if he had forgotten how to do it. He had been in that cloth prison, probably ever since he had been in the institution. Then he squatted on his bed, moving his arms and staring around his room, recognizing it and her at last. He said, "Open the door." She said, "No, not until I am sure you will behave well." He was about to start again, but she shouted at him, "Ben, I mean it. You shout and scream, and I'll tie you up." He controlled himself. She handed him sandwiches, which he crammed into his mouth, choking. He had unlearned all the basic social skills that it had been so hard to teach him. She talked quietly while he ate. "And now listen to me, Ben. You have to listen. You behave well, and everything will be all right. You must eat properly. You must use the pot or go to the lavatory. And you mustn't scream and fight." She was not sure he heard her. She repeated it. She went on repeating it. That evening she stayed with Ben, and she did not see the other children at all. David went up to the other room away from her. How she felt at this time was that she was shielding them from Ben while she re-educated him for family life. But how they felt it, she knew, was that she had turned her back on them all and chosen to go off into alien country with Ben. That night she locked the door on him and bolted it, left him undrugged and hoped he would sleep. He did, but woke, screaming in fear. She went into him and found him backed against the wall at the end of the bed, an arm up over his face, unable to hear her, while she talked and talked, using reasonable persuasive words against this storm of terror. At last he became quiet and she gave him food. He could not get enough food. He had really been starving. They had had to keep him drugged, and when drugged, he could not eat. Fed, he again backed himself against the wall, squatted on the bed, and looked at the door where his jailers would enter. He had not really understood he was at home. Then he nodded off, woke with a bellow, nodded off, woke. She calmed him, and he dropped off. Days passed, nights passed. He at last understood he was at home and safe. Slowly, he stopped eating as if every mouthful were his last. Slowly, he used his pot, and then allowed himself to be taken by the hand along the passage to the lavatory. Then he came downstairs, darting glances around him to see the enemy before he could be captured again. As he saw it, this house was where he had been trapped. And by his father. When he first set eyes on David, he backed away, hissing. David did not try to reassure him. As far as he was concerned, Ben was Harriet's responsibility, and his was for the children, the real children. Ben took his place at the big table, among the other children. He kept his eyes on his father, who had betrayed him. Helen said, "Hello, Ben." Then Luke, "Hello, Ben." Then Jane. Not Paul, who was miserable that Ben was there again, and took himself off to flump into a chair and pretend to watch television. Ben at last said, "Hello." His eyes were moving from face to face, friend or foe. He ate, watching them. When they went to sit and watch television, he did, too, copying them for safety, and looked at the screen because they did. And so things went back to normal, if that was a word that could be used. But Ben did not trust his father. He never trusted him again. David could not even come near him without Ben freezing and backing away, and, if he came too close, snarling. When she was sure Ben had recovered, Harriet acted on an idea she had been developing. The garden had got badly out of hand last summer, and a youth called John came to help with it. He was unemployed and did odd jobs. For a few days he had cut hedges, dug up a couple of ailing shrubs, sawed off a dead branch, mowed the lawn. Ben would not be parted from him. He crouched at the French doors, waiting for John to arrive, then followed him around like a puppy. John did not mind Ben at all. He was a big, shaggy, amiable youth, good-natured, patient. He treated Ben in a rough-and-ready way, as if Ben were indeed a puppy that needed training. "No, you must sit there now and wait till I've done. Hold these shears for me, that's right. No, I'm going home now, you can come to the gate with me." Ben sometimes whined and grizzled when John went off. Now Harriet went down to a certain cafe, Betty's Caf, as it was known, where she knew he hung out, and found him there with some mates. This was a gang of unemployed young men, about 10 of them, and sometimes there were a couple of girls. She did not bother to explain anything, for by now she knew that people understood very well, that is, if they weren't experts, doctors. She sat among these youths and said that it would be 2 years, perhaps more, before Ben went to school. He wasn't suitable for ordinary nursery school. She looked at John deliberately in the eyes when she used the word suitable, and he simply nodded. She would like Ben taken care of during the day. The money would be good. "You want me up at your house?" John asked, saying no to this proposition. "It would be up to you," said Harriet. "He likes you, John. He trusts you." He looked at his mates. They consulted each other with their eyes. Then he nodded. Now he arrived most mornings about 9, and Ben went off with him on his motorbike, went exultantly, laughing, without a look back at his mother, his father, his brothers and sisters. The understanding was that Ben should be kept well away from his home until supper time, but often it was long after that when he arrived. He had become part of the group of young unemployed, who hung about on pavements, sat around in cafes, sometimes did odd jobs, went to the cinema, rushed about on motorbikes or in borrowed cars. The family became a family again. Well, almost. David came back to sleep in the connubial room. There was a distance between them. David had made and now kept this distance because Harriet had hurt him so badly. She understood this. Harriet informed him that she was now on the pill. For both it was a bleak moment, because of everything they had stood for, in the past, which had made it impossible for her to be on the pill. They had felt it deeply wrong so to tamper with the processes of nature. Nature, they now reminded themselves they once felt, was at some level or other to be relied upon. Harriet rang up Dorothy and asked her if she would come for a week, and then begged David to go off with her on a holiday somewhere. They had not been alone ever since Luke was born. They chose a quiet country hotel and walked a good deal and were considerate with each other. Their hearts ached a good deal, but then that seemed to be something they must live with. Sometimes, particularly in their happiest moments, they could not stop their eyes from filling. But at nights when she lay in her husband's arms, Harriet knew this was nothing like the real thing, not like the past. She said, "Suppose we do what we said we would, go on having children?" She felt how his body tensed, felt his anger. And so it all never happened. He asked at last, and she knew he was curious to hear her. He could not believe his ears. Another Ben wouldn't happen again. Why should it? "It's not a question of another Ben," he remarked at last, and he was keeping his voice emotionless because of his anger. She knew that what he could have assaulted her with was exactly what she always tried to conceal from herself, or at least the worst of it. She had dealt the family a mortal wound when she rescued Ben. She persisted, "We could have more children. And the 4 we have don't count? Perhaps it would bring us all together again, make things better." He was silent, and against that silence she could hear how false her words had rung. At last he inquired, in the same emotionless way, "And what about Paul?" For it was Paul who was the most damaged. "Perhaps he would get over it," she said hopelessly. "He is not going to get over it, Harriet." And now his voice vibrated with what he was suppressing. She turned away from him and lay weeping. When the summer holidays were due, Harriet wrote careful letters to everyone, explaining that Ben was hardly ever in the house. She felt unfaithful and treacherous doing this. But to whom? Some of them came. Not Molly or Frederick, who did not forgive her for bringing Ben back, nor would they ever, she knew. Her sister Sarah came with Amy and with Dorothy, who now was Amy's support against the world. But Amy's brothers and sisters went to stay with their other cousins, Angela's children, and the Lovett children knew they would not have company for the holidays because of Ben. Briefly, Deborah was there. She had been married and divorced since they had seen her. She was a spiky, elegant, increasingly witty and desperate girl who was a good aunt to the children, in an impulsive, unskilled way, with expensive and unsuitable presents. James was there. He said several times that the house was like a large fruitcake, but this was kindness. There were some grown-up cousins at a loose end and a colleague of David's. And where was Ben? One day, Harriet was shopping in the town, and she heard the roar of a motorbike behind her and turned to see a creature like a space-age jockey, presumably John, crouched low over the bars, and behind him, clutching tight, a dwarf child. She saw her son Ben, his mouth open in what seemed to be a chant or yell of exultation. Ecstatic. She had never seen him like this. Happy? Was that the word? She knew he had become a pet or a mascot for this group of young men. They treated him roughly, it seemed to Harriet, even unkindly, calling him dopey, dwarfy, alien too, hobbit, and gremlin. Hey, dopey, you're in my way. Go and fetch me a cigarette from Jack, hobbit. But he was happy. In the mornings, he was at the window waiting for one of them to come and fetch him. If they failed him, rang up to say they couldn't make it that day, he was full of rage and deprivation and stamped bellowing about the house. It was all costing a good bit of money. John and his gang were having good times at the Lovetts' expense. Not only, these days, at the expense of James, Ben's grandfather, for David was doing all kinds of extra work. They did not scruple to put the screws on. We'll take Ben off to the sea if you like. Oh good, that'd be lovely. It'll be 20 quid, then, there's petrol. And the roaring machines went off to the coast, crowded with young men and girls, Ben with them. When they returned him, that cost more than we thought. How much? Another 10 quid. It's very nice for him, a cousin might say, hearing that Ben was off to the seaside, just as if this were a normal thing, a little boy being taken off for a treat. He would come in from a day of safety and enjoyment with John and his mates, where he was teased and roughed up, but accepted, and stand by the table, where his family was, all looking at him, their faces grave and cautious. Give me bread, he would say. Give me biscuits. Sit down, Ben, Luke or Helen or Jane, never Paul, would say, in the patient, decent way they had with him, which hurt Harriet. He scrambled energetically onto a chair and set himself to be like them. He knew he mustn't talk with his mouth full, for instance, or eat with his mouth open. He carefully obeyed such imperatives, the energetic animal movements of his jaws confined behind closed lips, waiting till his mouth was empty before saying, Ben, get down now. Ben wants go to bed. He was not in the baby's room now, but the one nearest to his parents on the landing. The baby's room was empty. They could not lock him in at night. The sound of a key turning, the slide of a bolt, made him explode into screaming, kicking rage. But the last thing before they slept, the other children locked their doors quietly from inside. This meant Harriet could not go into them to see how they were before she went to bed, or if they were sick. She did not like to ask them not to lock their doors, nor make a big thing of it by calling in a locksmith and having special locks fitted, openable from the outside by an adult with a key. This business of the children locking themselves in made her feel excluded, forever shut out and repudiated by them. Sometimes she went softly to one of their doors and whispered to be let in, and she was admitted, and there was a little festival of kisses and hugs, but they were thinking of Ben, who might come in. And several times he did arrive silently in the doorway and stare in at the scene, which he could not understand. Harriet would have liked to lock their door. David said, trying to joke about it, that he would one of these days. More than once she woke to see Ben standing silently there in the half-dark, staring at them. The shadows from the garden moved on the ceiling, the spaces of the big room emptied into obscurity, and there stood this goblin child, half visible. The pressure of those inhuman eyes of his had entered her sleep and woken her. Go to sleep, Ben, she would say gently, keeping her voice level because of the sharp fear she felt. What was he thinking as he stood there, watching them sleep? Did he want to hurt them? Was he experiencing a misery she could not begin to imagine, because he was forever shut out from the ordinariness of this house and its people? Did he want to put his arms around her like the other children, but not know how? But when she put her arms around him, there was no response, no warmth. It was as if he did not feel her touch. But after all, he was in the house very little. "We aren't far off being normal again," she said to David. Hopefully, longing for him to reassure her. But he only nodded and did not look at her. In fact, those 2 years before Ben went to school were not too bad. Afterwards, she looked back on them gratefully. In the year Ben was 5, Luke and Helen announced they wanted to go to boarding school. They were 13 and 11. Of course, this went against everything Harriet and David believed in. They said, too, that they could not afford it. But again, the parents had to face how much the children understood, how they discussed and planned and then acted. Luke had already written to grandfather James, Helen to grandmother Molly. Their fees would be paid for. Luke said, in his reasonable way, they agree it would be better for us. We know you can't help it, but we don't like Ben. This had happened just after Harriet had come down one morning, Luke and Helen, Jane and Paul behind her, to see Ben squatting on the big table, with an uncooked chicken he had taken from the refrigerator, which stood open. Its contents spilled all over the floor. Ben had raided it in some savage fit he could not control. Grunting with satisfaction, he tore the raw chicken apart with teeth and hands, pulsing with barbaric strength. He had looked up over the partly shredded and dismembered carcass at Harriet, at his siblings, and snarled. Then Harriet saw the vitality die down in him as she scolded, "Naughty Ben," and he made himself stand up there on the table, and then jump down to the floor and face her, the remains of the chicken dangling in one hand. "Poor Ben hungry," he whined. He had taken to calling himself Poor Ben. He had heard someone say this? In the group of young men and their girls, had someone said, "Poor Ben," and he had then known it fitted him? Was this how he thought of himself? If so, this was a window into a Ben concealed from them, and it broke one's heart, broke Harriet's heart, to be accurate. The children had not commented at all on this scene. They had sat themselves around the table for breakfast, looking at each other, not at her or at Ben. There was no way Ben could get out of going to school. She had given up trying to read to him, play with him, teach him anything. He could not learn. But she knew the authorities would never recognize this or acknowledge that they did. They would say, and rightly, that he did know a lot of things that made him into a part social being. He knew facts. Traffic lights green, go. Traffic lights red, stop. Or half a plate of chips, half price big plate of chips. Or shut the door because it is cold. He would sing-song these truths, imparted to him presumably by John, looking at Harriet for confirmation. Eat with a spoon, not with fingers. Hold on tight going around corners. Sometimes Harriet heard him singing these slogans in bed at night, thinking of the delights of the day to come. When he was told he must go to school, he said he would not. Harriet said there was no way around it, to school he must go. But he could be with John at weekends and on holidays. Tantrums, rages, despair, roars of no, no, no. The whole house resounded with it. John was summoned. He arrived in the kitchen with 3 of his gang. John, instructed by Harriet, said to Ben, "Now listen, mate. You just listen to us. You've got to go to school." "Will you be there?" asked Ben, standing by John's knee, looking trustfully up at him. Rather, his pose, the set of his lifted face, said he trusted John, but his eyes seemed to have shrunk into his head with fear. "No, but I was at school. When I had to be." Here the 4 young men laughed, for of course they had played truant, as all their sort did. School was irrelevant to them. "I was at school. Roland here was at school. Barry and Henry were at school." That's right, they all said, playing their parts. "And I was at school," said Harriet. But Ben did not hear her. She did not count. It was finally arranged that Harriet would take Ben to school in the mornings, and that John would be responsible for picking him up. Ben would spend the hours between school's end and bedtime with the gang. For the sake of the family, thought Harriet, for the children's sake, for my sake and David's. Though he seems to come home later and later. Meanwhile, the family had, as she felt it, saw it fallen apart. Luke and Helen had gone to their respective boarding schools. In the house were left Jane and Paul, who were both at the same school Ben was at, but being in higher classes would not see much of Ben. Jane continued solid, sensible, quiet, and as able to save herself as Luke or Helen. She seldom came home after school, but went to friends. Paul did come home. He was alone with Harriet, and this, she thought, was what he wanted and needed. He was demanding, shrill, difficult, often in tears. Where was that enchanting, delicious little child, her Paul? She wondered as he nagged and whined, now a lanky 6-year-old, with great soft blue eyes that often stared at nothing or seemed to protest at what he saw. He was too thin. He had never eaten properly. She brought him home from school and tried to make him sit down and eat, or she sat with him and read and told him stories. He could not concentrate. He mooned restlessly about and daydreamed, then came to Harriet to touch her or climb on her lap like a smaller child, never appeased or at rest or content. He had not had a mother at the proper time, and that was the trouble, and they all knew it. When he heard the roar of the machine that was bringing Ben back home, Paul might burst into tears or bang his head on the wall with frustration. After Ben had been at school for a month and there had been no unpleasant news, she asked his teacher how he was getting on. She heard, to her surprise, "He's a good little chap. He tries so hard." Towards the end of the first term, she was summoned on the telephone by the headmistress, Mrs. Graves. "Mrs. Lovett, I wonder if you..." An efficient woman, she knew what went on in her school, and that Harriet was the responsible parent of Luke, Helen, Jane, and Paul. "We all find ourselves at a loss," said she. "Ben is really trying very hard. He doesn't seem to fit in with the others. It's hard to put one's finger on it." Harriet sat waiting, as she had done, it seemed to her, far too often in Ben's short life, for some kind of acknowledgement that here might be more than a difficulty of adjustment. She remarked, "He has always been an oddball." "The odd man out in the family?" "Well, there's usually one, I've often noticed it," said affable Mrs. Graves. While this surface conversation went on, the sensitized Harriet was listening for the other, parallel conversation that Ben's existence compelled. "These young men who come and collect Ben, it's an unusual arrangement," smiled Mrs. Graves. "He's an unusual child," said Harriet, looking hard at the headmistress, who nodded, not looking at Harriet. She was frowning, as if some annoying thought were poking at her, wanting attention, but she did not feel inclined to give it any. "Have you ever known a child like Ben before?" Harriet asked. This risked the headmistress saying, "What do you mean, Mrs. Lovett?" And in fact Mrs. Graves did say, "What do you mean, Mrs. Lovett?" but quickly, and then, to stop Harriet telling her, she funked it with, "He is hyperactive, perhaps?" Of course, that is a word that I often feel evades the issue. To say a child is hyperactive does not say very much. But he does have this extraordinary energy. He can't keep still long. Well, a lot of children can't. His teacher has found him a rewarding little boy because he does try, but she says she has to put more effort into him than all the rest put together. Well, Mrs. Lovett, I'm glad you came in, it has been a help. And as Harriet left, she saw how the headmistress watched her with that long, troubled inspection that held unacknowledged unease, even horror, which was part of the other conversation, the real one. Towards the end of the second term, she was telephoned. Would she come in at once, please? Ben had hurt someone. Here it was. This is what she had dreaded. Ben had suddenly gone berserk and attacked a bigger girl in the playground. He had pulled her down so that she fell heavily on the asphalt, bruising and grazing her legs. Then he had bitten her and bent back her arm until it broke. "I have spoken to Ben," said Mrs. Graves. "He doesn't seem to be remorseful in any way. You might even think he doesn't know he did it. But at that age, he is 6, after all. He should know what he is doing." Harriet took Ben home, leaving Paul to be picked up later. It was Paul she wanted to take with her. The child had heard of the attack and was hysterical, screaming that Ben would kill him, too. But she had to be alone with Ben. Ben sat on the kitchen table, swinging his legs, eating bread and jam. He had asked if John would come here to pick him up. It was John he needed. Harriet said, "You hurt poor Mary Jones today." "Why did you do that, Ben?" He seemed not to hear, but tore lumps of bread off with his teeth and then gulped them down. Harriet sat down close to him so that he could not ignore her and said, "Ben, do you remember that place you went to in the van?" He went rigid. He slowly turned his head and looked at her. The bread in his hand was trembling. He was trembling. He remembered, all right. She had never done this before, had hoped she would never have to. "Well, do you remember, Ben?" His eyes had a wild look. He could have jumped down from the table and run off. He wanted to, but was glaring around into the corners of the room, at the windows, up the staircase, as if he might be attacked from these places. "Now listen to me, Ben. If you ever hurt anyone again, you'll have to go back there." She kept her eyes on his and hoped that he could not know she was saying inwardly, "But I'd never send him back, never." He sat shivering like a wet, cold dog, in spasms, and he went through a series of movements, unconsciously, the vestiges of reactions from that time. A hand went up to shield his face, and he looked through the spread fingers as if this hand could protect him. Then the hand fell, and he turned his head away sharply, pressing the back of the other hand to his mouth, glaring in terror over it. He briefly bared his teeth to snarl, but then checked himself. He lifted his chin, and his mouth opened, and Harriet saw that he could have emitted a long, animal howl. It was as if she actually heard this howl, its lonely terror. "Did you hear me, Ben?" Harriet said softly. He slid down off the table and thumped his way up the stairs. He left behind him a thin trail of urine. She heard his door shut, then the bellow of rage and fear he had been holding back. She rang John at Betty's cafe. He came at once, by himself, as she had asked. He heard the story and went up to Ben in his room. Harriet stood outside the door, listening. "You don't know your own strength, Hobbit, that's the trouble. It's wrong to hurt people." "Are you angry with Ben? Are you going to hurt Ben?" "Who's angry?" said John. "But if you hurt people, then they hurt you." "Is Mary Jones going to hurt me?" A silence. John was nonplussed. "Take me to the cafe with you? Take me now, take me away now." She heard John looking for a clean pair of dungarees, heard him persuading Ben into them. She went down into the kitchen. John came down the stairs with Ben, who clung to his hand. John gave her a wink and a thumbs-up sign. He departed with Ben on his motorbike. She went to bring Paul home. When she asked Dr. Brett to arrange an appointment with a specialist, she said, "Please don't make me out as some kind of hysterical idiot." She took Ben to London. She left him in the care of Dr. Gilly's nurse. This doctor liked to see a child first, without its parents. It seemed sensible. Perhaps she is sensible, this one, thought Harriet, sitting by herself drinking coffee in a little cafe, and then wondered, what do I mean by that? What am I hoping for this time? What she wanted, she decided, was that at last someone would use the right words, share the burden. No, she did not expect to be rescued, or even that anything much could change. She wanted to be acknowledged, her predicament given its value. Well, was it likely? In conflict, half full of a longing for support, half cynical. Well, what do you expect? She returned to find Ben with the nurse in a little room off the waiting room. With his back to the wall, Ben watched the nurse's every movement, as a wary animal does. When he saw his mother, he rushed to her and hid behind her. "Well," said the nurse tartly, "there's no need for that, Ben." Harriet told Ben to sit down and wait for her. She was coming back soon. He got behind a chair and stood alert, his eyes on the nurse. Then Harriet was sitting opposite a shrewd professional woman who had been told. Harriet was convinced that this was an unreasonable, worrying mother who couldn't handle her fifth child. Dr. Gilly said, "I'm going to come straight to the point, Mrs. Lovett. The problem is not with Ben, but with you. You don't like him very much." "Oh my God," exploded Harriet, "not again." She sounded peevish, whiny. She watched Dr. Gilly, noting her reaction. "Dr. Brett told you that," she said. "Now you are saying it." "Well, Mrs. Lovett, would you say it is untrue? First, I must say it is not your fault. And then that it is not uncommon. We can't choose what will turn up in the lottery, and that is what having a baby is. Luckily or unluckily, we can't choose. The first thing you have to do is not to blame yourself. I don't blame myself, said Harriet. Though I don't expect you to believe it. But it's a bad joke. I feel I've been blamed for Ben ever since he was born. I feel like a criminal. I've always been made to feel like a criminal. During this complaint, shrill, but Harriet could not change her voice. Years of bitterness came pouring out. Meanwhile, Dr. Gilly sat looking at her desk. It really is extraordinary. No one has ever said to me, no one, ever, how clever of you to have 4 marvelous, normal, clever, good-looking children. They are a credit to you. Well done, Harriet. Don't you think it is strange that no one has ever said it? But about Ben, I'm a criminal. Dr. Gilly inquired, after a pause for analysis of what Harriet had said. You resent the fact that Ben isn't clever, is that it? Oh my God, said Harriet violently. What is the point? The two women eyed each other. Harriet sighed, letting her violence subside. The doctor was angry, but not showing it. Tell me, said Harriet, are you saying that Ben is a perfectly normal child in every way? There's nothing strange about him. He is within the range of normality. He is not very good at school, I am told, but often slow children catch up later. I can't believe it, said Harriet. Look, just do something. Oh, all right, humor me. Ask the nurse to bring Ben in here. Dr. Gilly considered this, then spoke into her machine. They heard Ben shouting, no, no, and the nurse's persuasive voice. The door opened. Ben appeared. He had been pushed into the room by the nurse. The door shut behind him, and he backed against it, glaring at the doctor. He stood with his shoulders hunched forward and his knees bent, as if about to spring off somewhere. He was a squat, burly little figure with a big head, the yellow stubble of his coarse hair growing from the double crown of his head into the point low on his heavy, narrow forehead. He had a flattish, flaring nose that turned up. His mouth was fleshy and curly. His eyes were like lumps of dull stone. For the first time, Harriet thought, but he doesn't look like a 6-year-old, but much older. You could almost take him for a little man, not a child at all. The doctor looked at Ben. Harriet watched them both. The doctor then said, all right, Ben, go out again. Your mother will be with you in a minute. Ben stood petrified. Again, Dr. Gilly spoke into her machine. The door opened, and Ben was hauled backwards out of sight, snarling. Tell me, Dr. Gilly, what did you see? Dr. Gilly's pose was wary, offended. She was calculating the time left to the end of the interview. She did not answer. Harriet said, knowing it was no use, but because she wanted it said, heard, he's not human, is he? Dr. Gilly suddenly, unexpectedly, allowed what she was thinking to express itself. She sat up, sighed heavily, put her hands to her face and drew them down, until she sat with her eyes shut, her fingers on her lips. She was a handsome, middle-aged woman, in full command of her life, but for the flash of a moment an unlicensed and illegitimate distress showed itself, and she looked beside herself, even tipsy. Then she decided to repudiate what Harriet knew was a moment of truth. She let her hands fall, smiled, and said jokingly, from another planet? Outer space. No. Well, you saw him, didn't you? How do we know what kinds of people, races, I mean, creatures different from us, have lived on this planet? In the past, you know? We don't really know, do we? How do we know that dwarves or goblins or hobgoblins, that kind of thing, didn't really live here? And that's why we tell stories about them? They really existed once. Well, how do we know they didn't? You think Ben is a throwback? Inquired Dr. Gilly gravely. She sounded as if quite prepared to entertain the idea. It seems to me obvious, said Harriet. Another silence, and Dr. Gilly examined her well-kept hands. She sighed. Then she looked up and met Harriet's eyes with, if that is so, then what do you expect me to do about it? Harriet insisted, I want it said. I want it recognized. I just can't stand it never being said. Can you see that it is simply outside my competence? If it is true, that is. Do you want me to give you a letter to the zoo, put this child in a cage? Or hand him over to science? Oh God, said Harriet. No, of course not. Silence. Thank you, Dr. Gilly, said Harriet, ending the interview in the regular way. She stood up. Would you be prepared to give me a prescription for a really strong sedative? There are times when I can't control Ben, and I have to have something to help me. The doctor wrote. Harriet took the bit of paper. She thanked Dr. Gilly. She said goodbye. She went to the door and glanced back. On the doctor's face, she saw what she expected, a dark fixed stare that reflected what the woman was feeling, which was horror at the alien, rejection by the normal for what was outside the human limit. Horror of Harriet, who had given birth to Ben. She found Ben alone in the little room, backed into a corner, glaring, unblinking, at the door she came in by. He was trembling. People in white uniforms, white coats, in rooms that smelled of chemicals. Harriet realized that without meaning it, she had reinforced her threats. If you behave badly, then. He was subdued. He kept close to her, no, not like a child with its mother, but like a frightened dog. Every morning now, she gave Ben a dose of the sedative, which, however, did not have much effect on him. But she hoped it would keep him damped down until school ended and he could roar off with John on the motorbike. Then it was the end of Ben's first year at school. This meant that they could all go on, pretending that not much was wrong. He was just a difficult child. He wasn't learning anything, but then plenty of children did not. They put in time at school, and that was all. That Christmas, Luke wrote to say he wanted to go to his grandparents, who were somewhere off the coast of southern Spain, and Helen went to grandmother Molly's house in Oxford. Dorothy came for Christmas, just 3 days. She took Jane back with her. Jane adored the little Mongol child Amy. Ben spent all his time with John. Harriet and David when he was there, but he worked more and more, were with Paul through the Christmas holidays. Paul was even more difficult than Ben. But he was a normal, disturbed child, not an alien. Paul spent hours watching television. He escaped into it, watching restlessly, moving about as he watched, and ate, but never put on weight. Inside him seemed to be an unappeasable mouth that said, "Feed me, feed me." He craved every bit of him for what? His mother's arms did not satisfy him. He was too restless to stay in them. He liked being with David, but never for long. It was the television that quieted him. Wars and riots, killings and hijackings, murders and thefts and kidnappings, the 80s. The barbarous 80s were getting into their stride, and Paul lay sprawled in front of the set, or wandered about the room, eating and watching, being nourished. So it seemed. The patterns for the family had been set, and so the future would be. Luke always went for his school holidays to grandfather James, with whom he got on so well. He liked his grandmother Jessica, who was great fun, he said. His Aunt Deborah was fun, too. Her attempts and failures at matrimony were a long-running serial story, presented comically. Luke was living with the rich and thriving, and sometimes James brought him home to visit his parents, for the kindly man was unhappy at what went on in that misfortuned house, and knew that Harriet and David yearned for their eldest. They did visit him at his school for sports days, and Luke sometimes came home for half-terms. Helen was happy at Molly's house. She lived in the room her father had once made his real home. She was old Frederick's favorite. She, too, sometimes came for a half-term. Jane had prevailed on Dorothy to come and reason with Harriet and David, for she wanted to live with Dorothy and Aunt Sarah and the 3 healthy cousins and poor Amy. And so she did. Dorothy brought Jane home sometimes, and the parents could see that Dorothy had talked to Jane to make her kind to them, and never, not ever, criticized Ben. Paul remained at home. He was there much more than Ben. David said to Harriet, "What are we going to do with Paul? What can we do? He needs treatment of some kind. A psychiatrist. What good is that going to do? He's not learning anything. He's a real mess. He's worse than Ben. At least Ben is what he is, whatever that may be, and I don't think I want to know. But Paul. And how are we going to pay for it? I will." David now added a part-time job teaching at a polytechnic to his already heavy load of work, and was hardly ever at home. If he did come home during the week, it was late at night, and he fell into bed and slept exhausted. Paul was sent to talk to someone, as the phrase goes. He went nearly every afternoon after school. This was a success. The psychiatrist was a man of 40, with a family and a pleasant house. Paul stayed there for supper, and even went over to play with the children when he did not actually have an appointment to talk with the doctor. Sometimes Harriet was alone in that great house all day, until Paul came home at about 7 to watch the television, and Ben, too, though his television watching was different. His attention was held by the screen unpredictably, and according to no pattern Harriet could see, usually only for a minute or two. The two boys hated each other. Once, Harriet found Paul in a corner of the kitchen, stretched up on tiptoes, trying to evade Ben's hands, which were reaching up to his throat. Short, powerful Ben, tall, spidery Paul. If Ben wanted to, he could kill Paul. Harriet thought that Ben was trying to frighten Paul, but Paul was hysterical. Ben grinned vindicatively, full of triumph. "Ben," said Harriet. "Ben, down." As if to a dog, warning it. "Down, Ben, down." He turned sharply, saw her, dropped his hands. She put into her eyes the threat she had already used, her power over him, his memories of the past. He bared his teeth and snarled. Paul screamed, his terror bursting out of him. He raced up the stairs, slipping and falling, to get away from the horror that was Ben. "If you ever do that again," threatened Harriet. Ben went slowly to the big table and sat down. He was thinking, so she believed. "If you ever do that again, Ben." He raised his eyes and looked at her. He was calculating, she could see. But what? Those cold, inhuman eyes. What did he see? People assumed he saw what they did, that he saw a human world. But perhaps his senses accommodated quite different facts, Data. How could anyone know? What was he thinking? How did he see himself? Poor Ben, he would sometimes still say. Harriet did not tell David about this incident. She knew he was at the edge of what he could stand. And what was she going to say? Ben tried to kill Paul today. This was a long way beyond what they had set for themselves, outside the permissible. Besides, she did not believe Ben was trying to kill Paul. He was demonstrating what he could do if he wanted to. She told Paul that Ben was absolutely not trying to hurt him, only to frighten him. She thought Paul believed her. 2 years before Ben was due to leave the school where he learned nothing, but at least had not harmed anyone, John came to say he was departing from their lives. He had been granted a place in a job training scheme in Manchester. He and 3 of his mates. Ben was there, listening. He had been told by John already in Betty's cafe. But he had not taken it in. John had come up on purpose to say this to Harriet, with Ben present, so that Ben could accept it. "Why can't I come, too?" demanded Ben. "Because you can't, mate. But when I come and visit my mother and father, I'll come and see you." Ben insisted, "But why can't I come with you?" "Because I'll be at school, too. Not here. I'll be far away. Far, far away." Ben stiffened. He assumed his rigid crouching pose, fists held out. He ground his teeth together, his eyes malevolent. "Ben," said Harriet, using her special voice. "Ben, stop it." "Come on now, Hobbit," said John, uneasy but kind. "I can't help it. I've got to get away from home sometime, haven't I? Is Barry going? Is Roland going? Is Henry?" "Yes, all 4 of us." Suddenly, Ben rushed out into the garden, where he began kicking at a tree trunk, letting out squeals of rage. "Better the tree than me," said John. "Or me," said Harriet. "I'm sorry," said John. "But there it is." "I cannot imagine what we would have done without you," said Harriet. He nodded, knowing it was true. And so John left their lives for good. Ben had been with him almost every day of his life since he was rescued from the institution. Ben took it hard. At first, he did not believe it. When Harriet arrived to fetch him and, sometimes, Paul from school, he would be at the school gates, staring down the road where John had appeared gloriously on his motorbike. Reluctantly, he went home with her, sitting in the corner of the back seat opposite from Paul, if Paul was not at the psychiatrist's, and his eyes searched the streets for signs of his lost friends. More than once, when he was not anywhere in the house, Harriet found him in Betty's cafe, sitting isolated at a table, his eyes on the door, where they might appear. In the street one morning, a minor member of John's gang was standing outside a shop window, and Ben, crowing with pleasure, rushed to him. But the youth said casually, "Hi, it's Dumbo." "Hello, dopey," and turned away. Ben stood transfixed with disbelief, his mouth open, as if he had received a blow across it. It took him a long time to understand. As soon as he got home with Harriet and Paul, he would be off again, running into the center of the town. She did not follow him. He would come back. He had nowhere else, and she was always pleased to have Paul alone with her if Paul was there. Once, Ben came thumping into the house with his heavy run and dived under the big table. A policewoman appeared and said to Harriet, "Where's that child?" "Is he all right?" "He's under the table," said Harriet. But what for?" "I only wanted to make sure he wasn't lost." "How old is he?" "Older than he looks," said Harriet. "Come out, Ben, it's all right." He would not come out. He was on all fours, facing where the policewoman stood, watching her neat, shiny black shoes. He was remembering how once someone in a car had captured him and taken him away. Uniforms, the aroma of officialdom. "Well," said the policewoman, "anyone think I was a child snatcher? I shouldn't let him go running around like that. He might get himself kidnapped." "No such luck," said Harriet, every inch the jolly coping mum. "More likely he'd kidnap them." "It's like that, is it?" And the policewoman departed, laughing. David and Harriet lay side by side in their connubial bed, lights out, the house still. 2 rooms down, Ben slept, they hoped. For rooms down, at the end of the passage, Paul slept behind a self-locked door. It was late, and Harriet knew David would be asleep in a minute or two. They lay with a space between them. But it was no longer a space full of anger. Harriet knew that he was too permanently exhausted to be angry. Anyway, he had decided not to be angry. It was killing him. She always knew what he was thinking. He often answered, aloud, to her thoughts. They sometimes made love, but she felt, and knew he did, that the ghosts of young Harriet and young David entwined and kissed. It was as if the strain of her life had stripped off her a layer of flesh, not real flesh, but perhaps metaphysical substance, and invisible, unsuspected, until it had gone. And David, working as he did, had lost the self that was the family man. His efforts had made him successful in his firm, then gained him a much better job in another. But that now was where his center was. Events have their own logic. He was now the sort of man he had once decided never to be. James no longer supported this family. He only paid for Luke. The candor, the openness that had come from David's stubborn trust in himself had been overlaid by his new self-confidence. Harriet knew that if she were to meet David now, for the first time, she would think him hard. But he was not hard. The rock she felt there in him was endurance. He knew how to stick things out. They were still alike. Tomorrow, which was a Saturday, David was going to a cricket match at Luke's school. Harriet was visiting Helen at her school. Helen was in a play. Dorothy was coming in the morning to let the two escape for the weekend. Jane would not be with her, but at a party at a school friend's house she did not want to miss. Paul was going with his father to visit his brother. Ben would be alone with Dorothy, who had not seen him for a year. Harriet was not surprised when David said, "Do you think Dorothy understands how much older Ben is than he looks? Should we warn her?" But she understands everything after about 5 minutes. A silence. Harriet knew David was nearly asleep. He roused himself to say, "Harriet, has it occurred to you that in a couple of years' time Ben will be adolescent? He'll be a sexual being." "Yes, it has. But he's not on the same clock as we are. Presumably those people of his had something like an adolescence? How do we know? Perhaps they weren't as sexual as we are. Someone said we're oversexed." "Who?" "Yes, it was Bernard Shaw. All the same, the thought of Ben sexual scares me. He hasn't hurt anyone for a long time." After that weekend, Dorothy said to Harriet, "I wonder if Ben ever asks himself why he is so different from us." "How do we know? I've never known what he's thinking. Perhaps he thinks there's more of his kind somewhere. Perhaps he does. Provided it's not a female of the species. Ben makes you think, all those different people who lived on the earth once, they must be in us somewhere. All ready to pop up. But perhaps we simply don't notice them when they do," said Dorothy. "Because we don't want to," said Harriet. "I certainly don't want to," said Dorothy. "Not after seeing Ben." "Harriet, do you and David realize that Ben isn't a child any longer? We treat him like one, but those 2 years before Ben could go to the big school were bad for him. He was lonely, but did he know he was?" Harriet was very lonely and knew she was. Like Paul, when he was there, Ben now went at once to the television when he came in from school. He sometimes watched from 4 in the afternoon until 9 or 10 at night. He did not seem to like one program more than another. He did not understand that some programs were for children and others for grown-ups. What was the story of that film, Ben? Story. He tried the word, his thick, clumsy voice tentative. And his eyes were on her face to discover what she wanted. What happened in that film, the one you've just seen? Big cars, he would say. A motorbike. That girl crying. Car chased the man. Once, to see if Ben could learn from Paul, she said to Paul, "What was the story of that film?" "It was about bank robbers, wasn't it?" said Paul, full of scorn for stupid Ben, who was listening, his eyes moving from his mother's face to his brother's. They planned to rob the bank by tunneling. They nearly reached the vault, but the police caught them in a trap. They went to prison, but most of them escaped. 2 of them were shot by the police. Ben had listened carefully. "Tell me the story of the film, Ben." "Bank robbers," said Ben, and repeated what Paul had said, stumbling as he reached for exactly the same words. "But that was only because I told him," said Paul. Ben's eyes flared, but went cold as he told himself, "Harriet presumed I mustn't hurt anyone. If I do, they'll take me to that place." Harriet knew everything Paul was thinking, feeling. But Ben, she had to try to guess. Could Paul perhaps teach Ben without either of them knowing it? She would read a story to them both and ask Paul to repeat the story. Then Ben copied Paul. But inside a few minutes he had forgotten it. She played games like Snakes and Ladders and Ludo with Paul, Ben watching, and then, when Paul was with his other family, she invited Ben to try. But he could not get the hang of the games. Yet certain films he would watch over and over again and never tire of them. They had hired a video. He loved musicals. The Sound of Music, West Side Story, Oklahoma, Cats. And now she is going to sing, Ben told her when she asked, "What is happening now, Ben?" Or, "They're going to dance around, and then she will sing." Or, "They're going to hurt that girl." The girl ran away. Now it is a party. But he could not tell her the story of the film. "Sing me that tune, Ben. Sing it to me and Paul." But he could not. He loved the tune, but could bring out only a rough, tuneless roar. Harriet found Paul teasing Ben, asking him to sing a tune, then taunting him. Harriet saw fury blaze in Ben's eyes and told Paul not to do that ever again. "Why not?" cried Paul. "Why not? It's always Ben, Ben, Ben." He flailed his arms at Ben. Ben's eyes glittered. He was about to spring on Paul. "Ben," warned Harriet. It seemed to her that these efforts she made to humanize him drove him away into himself, where he, but what, remembered, dreamed of, his own kind. Once, when she knew he was in the house, but could not find him, she went up from floor to floor looking into the rooms. The first floor, which was still inhabited, with David and herself, Ben and Paul, though 3 of the rooms were empty, their beds standing ready, spread with fresh pillows and laundered duvets. The second floor, with its clean, empty rooms. The third floor, how long since children's voices, their laughter, filled that floor and spilled out of the open windows all over the garden. But Ben was not in any of those rooms. She went on quietly up to the attic. The door was open. From the high skylight fell a distorted rectangle of light, and in it stood Ben, staring up at dim sunlight. She could not make out what he wanted, what he felt. He heard her, and then she saw the Ben that this life he had to lead kept subdued. In one leap he had reached the dark at the edge of the eaves and vanished. All she could see was the obscurities of an attic that seemed boundless. She could hear nothing. He was crouching there, staring out at her. She felt the hair on her head lift, felt cold chills, instinctive, for she did not fear him with her mind. She was rigid with terror. "Ben," she said softly, though her voice shook. "Ben," putting into the word her human claim on him, and on this wild, dangerous attic where he had gone back into a faraway past that did not know human beings. No reply. Nothing. A blotch of shadow momentarily dimmed the thin, dirty light under the skylight. A bird had passed, on its way from one tree to another. She went downstairs and sat cold and lonely in the kitchen, drinking hot tea. Just before Ben went to the local secondary modern school, the only school of course that would have him, there was a summer holiday, almost like those in the past. People had written each other, had rung, those poor people, let's go there, at least for a week. Poor David, always that, Harriet knew. sometimes, rarely, poor Harriet. More often, irresponsible Harriet, selfish Harriet, crazy Harriet, who had not let Ben be murdered. She defended herself fiercely, in thought, never aloud. By everything the society she belonged to, stood for, believed in, she had had no alternative but to bring Ben back from that place. But because she had, and saved him from murder, she had destroyed her family, had harmed her life. David's, Luke's, Helen's, Jane's, and Paul's. Paul, the worst. Her thoughts circled in this groove. David kept saying she should simply not have gone up there, but how could she not have gone, being Harriet? And if she had not, she believed David would have. A scapegoat. She was the scapegoat, Harriet, the destroyer of her family. But another layer of thoughts or feelings ran deeper. She said to David, "We are being punished, that's all." "What for?" he demanded, already on guard because there was a tone in her voice he hated. "For presuming. For thinking we could be happy. Happy because we decided we would be." "Rubbish," he said. Angry. This Harriet made him angry. It was chance. Anyone could have got Ben. It was a chance, Jean, that's all. "I don't think so." She stubbornly held on. "We were going to be happy. No one else is, or I never seem to meet them, but we were going to be." And so down came the thunderbolt. "Stop it, Harriet. Don't you know where that thought leads? Pogroms and punishments, witch burnings and angry gods." He was shouting at her. "And scapegoats," said Harriet. "Don't forget the scapegoats. Vindictive gods, from thousands of years ago," he hotly contended, disturbed to his depths, she could see. Punishing gods, distributing punishments for insubordination. But who were we to decide we were going to be this or that? Who? We did. Harriet and David. We took the responsibility for what we believed in, and we did it. Then bad luck. That's all. We could easily have succeeded. We could have had just what we planned. 8 children in this house and everyone happy. Well, as far as possible. And who paid for it? James. And Dorothy in a different way. No, I'm just stating facts, David, not criticizing you. But this had long ago ceased to be a sore point with David. He said, James and Jessica have so much money they wouldn't have missed 3 times as much. Anyway, they adored doing it. And Dorothy, she complained about being used, but she's been Amy's nursemaid ever since she got fed up with us. We just wanted to be better than everyone else, that's all. We thought we were. No, that's how you're twisting it around now. All we wanted was to be ourselves. Oh, that's all, said Harriet airily, spitefully. That's all. Yes. Don't do it, Harriet, stop it. Well, if you won't, if you have to, then leave me out. I'm not going to be dragged back to the Middle Ages. Is that where we've been dragged back to? Molly and Frederick came, bringing Helen. They would not, forgive Harriet, but Helen must be considered. She was doing well at school, an attractive, self-sufficient girl of 16. But cool, distant. James brought Luke, 18 years old, a handsome boy, quiet, reliable, and steady. He was going to build boats, like his grandfather. He was a watcher, an observer, like his father. Dorothy came with Jane, 14. Non-academic, but none the worse for that, as Dorothy insisted. I could never pass an exam. The "and look at me" was unspoken, but Dorothy would challenge them all simply by her presence, which was less substantial than it had been. She was rather thin these days, and sat about a good deal. Paul, 11 years old, was histrionic, hysterical, always demanding attention. He talked a lot about his new school, a day school, which he hated. He wanted to know why he couldn't go to boarding school like all the others. David said, forestalling James with a proud look, that he would pay for it. Surely it is time you sold this house, Molly said, and what she was saying to her selfish daughter-in-law was, and then my son can stop killing himself working too hard for you. David came in quickly to support Harriet. I agree with Harriet. We shouldn't sell the house yet. Well, what do you think is going to change? Asked Molly cold. Ben certainly isn't. But privately David said something else. He would like the house sold. It's being with Ben in a small house. Just the thought of it, said Harriet. It wouldn't have to be a small house. But does it have to be the size of a hotel? David knew that even now, though it was foolish, she could not finally give up her dreams of the old life coming back. Then that holiday was gone. A success on the whole, for everyone tried hard. Except for Molly, so Harriet saw it. But it was sad for both parents. They had to sit listening to talk about people they had not met, only heard of. Luke and Helen visited families of school friends. And these people could never be asked here. In September of the year Ben became 11, he went to the big school. It was 1986. Harriet prepared herself for the telephone call that must come from the headmaster. It would be, she thought, towards the end of the first term. The new school would have been sent a report on Ben from the headmistress who had so consistently refused to acknowledge that there was anything remarkable about him. Ben Lovett is not an academic child, but what? He tries hard. Would that have been it? But he had long ago stopped trying to understand what he was taught, could hardly read or write more than his name. He still tried to fit in, to copy others. There was no telephone call, no letter. Ben, whom she examined for bruises every evening when he came home, seemed to have entered the tough and often brutal world of the secondary school without difficulty. Do you like this school, Ben? Yes. Better than the other school? Yes. As everyone knows, all these schools have a layer, like a sediment, of the uneducable, the unassimilable, the hopeless, who move up the school from class to class, waiting for the happy moment when they can leave. And, more often than not, they are truants, to the relief of their teachers. Ben had at once become one of these. Some weeks after he went to the big school, he brought home a large, shaggy dark youth, full of easy good nature. Harriet thought John. And then, but he must be John's brother. No, Ben had been drawn to this boy, it was clear, first of all because of his memories of that happy time with John. But his name was Derek, and he was 15, soon to leave school. Why did he put up with Ben, years younger than he was? Harriet watched the two as they helped themselves to food from the refrigerator, made themselves tea, sat in front of the television, talking more than they watched. In fact, Ben seemed older than Derek. They ignored her. Just as when Ben was the mascot, the pet of the gang of youths, John's gang, and had seemed to see only John, now his attention was for Derek. And soon, for Billy, for Elvis, and for Vic, who came in a gang after school and sat around and fed themselves from the refrigerator. Why did these big boys like Ben? She would look at them, from the stairs perhaps, as she came down into the living room. A group of youths, large or thin or plump, dark, fair or red-headed, and among them Ben, squat, powerful, heavy-shouldered. With his bristly yellow hair growing in that strange pattern, with his watchful, alien eyes, and she thought, but he's not really younger than they are. He's much shorter, yes. But it almost seems that he dominates them. When they sat around the big family table, talking in their style, which was loud, raucous, jeering, jokey, they were always looking at Ben. Yet he spoke very little. When he did say something, it was never much more than yes or no. Take this. Get that. Give me, whatever it was, a sandwich, a bottle of Coke. And he watched them carefully all the time. He was the boss of this gang, whether they knew it or not. They were a bunch of gangly, spotty, uncertain adolescents. He was a young adult. She had to conclude this finally, though for a while she believed that these poor children, who stayed together because they were found stupid, awkward, and unable to match up to their contemporaries, liked Ben because he was even clumsier and more inarticulate than they. No, she discovered that Ben Lovett's gang was the most envied in the school, and a lot of boys, not only the truants and dropouts, wanted to be part of it. Harriet watched Ben with his followers and tried to imagine him among a group of his own kind, squatting in the mouth of a cave around roaring flames, or a settlement of huts in a thick forest. No, Ben's people were at home under the earth, she was sure, deep underground in black caverns lit by torches. That was more like it. Probably those peculiar eyes of his were adapted for quite different conditions of light. She often sat in the kitchen, by herself, when they were across the low wall in the living room, watching the box. They might sprawl there for hours, all afternoon and evening. They made tea, raided the refrigerator, went out to fetch pies, or chips, or pizzas. They did not seem to mind what they watched. They liked the afternoon soap operas, did not turn off the children's programs, but best of all they enjoyed the bloody fare of the evening. Shootings and killings and tortures and fighting, this is what fed them. She watched them watching, but it was more as if they were actually part of the stories on the screen. They were unconsciously tensing and flexing, faces grinning or triumphant or cruel, and they let out groans or sighs or yells of excitement. That's it, do it. Carve him up. Kill him, slice him. And the moans of excited participation as the bullets poured into a body, as blood spurted, as the tortured victim screamed. These days, the local newspapers were full of news of muggings, hold-ups, break-ins. Sometimes this gang, Ben among them, did not come into the Lovitz house for a whole day, 2 days, 3. "Where have you been, Ben?" He replied indifferently, "Been with my friends." "Yes, but where?" "Been around. In the park, in a cafe, in the cinema, and, when they could borrow or steal, motorbikes, off to some seaside town." She thought of ringing the headmaster, but then, what is the point? If I were in his place, I'd be relieved they took themselves off. The police? Ben in the hands of the police? The gang always seemed to have plenty of money. More than once, dissatisfied with what they found in the refrigerator, they brought in feasts of food and ate all evening. Derek, never Ben, would offer her some. Like a bit of takeaway love? And she accepted, but sat apart from them, for she knew they would not want her too close. There were rapes, too, among those news items. She examined those faces, trying to match them with what she had read. Ordinary young men's faces, they all seemed older than 15, 16. Derek had a foolish look to him. At ugly moments on the screen, he laughed a lot in a weak, excitable way. Elvis was a lean, sharp blonde youth, very polite, but a nasty customer, she thought, with eyes as cold as Ben's. Billy was a hulk, stupid, with aggression in every movement. He would get so lost in the violence on the box that he would jump to his feet and seem almost to disappear into the screen, and then the others jeered at him, and he came to himself and sat down. He scared her. They all did. But, she thought, they weren't all that intelligent. Perhaps Elvis was. If they were stealing or worse, then who planned it all and looked after them? Ben? He does not know his own strength. That formula had gone with him through school. How did he control the rages that she knew could overcome him? She was always covertly on the watch for cuts, bruises, wounds. All had them, but nothing very bad. One morning, she came down the stairs to find Ben eating breakfast with Derek. That time she said nothing, but knew she could expect more. Soon she found 6 of them at breakfast. She had heard them, very late, creep upstairs and find beds for themselves. She stood by the table, looked at them bravely, ready to face them out, and said, "You aren't just to sleep here, anytime you feel like it." They kept their heads down and went on eating. "I mean it," she insisted. Derek said, laughing, intending to sound insolent. "Oh, sorry, I'm sure. But we thought you wouldn't mind." "I do mind," she said. "It's a big house," said Billy the lout, the one she was most afraid of. He did not look at her, but crammed food into his mouth and made a noise eating. "It's not your house," said Harriet. "One day we'll take it away from you," said Elvis, laughing loudly. "Oh, perhaps you will, yes." They all made revolutionary remarks like this when they remembered. "Come the revolution, we'll kill all the rich shits and then. There's one law for the rich and one for the poor, everybody knows that." They would say these things amiably, with that air of repletion people use when copying what others do, when they are part of a popular mood or movement. David came back from work late these days, and sometimes did not come at all. He stayed with one of the people he worked with. It happened that he arrived early one night and found the gang, 9 or 10 of them, watching television, with beer cans, cartons of takeaway Chinese, papers that had held fish and chips, all over the floor. He said, "Clear that mess up." They slowly got to their feet and cleared it up. He was a man, the man of the house. Ben cleared up with them. "That's enough," said David. "And now go home, all of you." They trailed off, and Ben went with them. Neither Harriet nor David said anything to stop him. They had not been alone together for some time. Weeks, she thought. He wanted to say something, but was afraid of arousing that dangerous anger of his. Can you see what is going to happen? He finally asked, sitting down with a plate of whatever he could find in the refrigerator. You mean, they're going to be here more often? Yes, that's what I mean. Can you see we should sell this place? Yes, I know we should, she said quietly, but he mistook her tone. For God's sake, Harriet, what can you be waiting for? It's crazy. The only thing I can think of now is that the children might be pleased we kept it. We have no children, Harriet. Or, rather, I have no children. You have one child. She felt that he would not be saying this if he were here more often. She said, there is something you aren't seeing, David. And what's that? Ben will leave. They'll all be off, and Ben will go with them. He considered her, his jaws moving slowly as he ate. He looked very tired. He was also looking much older than he was, could easily be taken as 60 rather than 50. He was a gray, rather stooped, shadowy man, with a strained look and a wary glance that expected trouble. This was what he was directing at her now. Why? They can come here any time they like, do what they like, help themselves to food. It's not exciting enough for them, that's why. I think they'll just drift off one day to London or some big town. They went off for 5 days last week. And Ben will go with them? Ben will go with them. And you won't go after him and bring him back? She did not reply. This was unfair, and he must know it. After a moment or two, he said, sorry. I'm so tired I don't know whether I'm coming or going. When he's gone, perhaps we could go and have a holiday together somewhere. Well, perhaps we could. This sounded as if he might even believe it, hope for it. Later they lay side by side, not touching, and talked practically about arrangements for visiting Jane at her school. And there was Paul at his with a parents' visiting day. They were alone in the big room where all the children but Ben had been born. Above them the emptiness of the upper floors and the attic. Downstairs, the empty living room and kitchen. They had locked the doors. If Ben decided to come home that night, he would have to ring. She said, with Ben gone, we could sell this and buy some sensible house somewhere. Perhaps the children would enjoy coming to visit if he wasn't there. No reply. David was asleep. Soon after that, Ben and the others went off again for some days. She saw them on the television. There was a riot in North London. Trouble had been forecast. They were not among those throwing bricks, lumps of iron, stones, but stood in a group at one side, leering and jeering and shouting encouragement. Next day they returned, but did not settle down to watching television. They were restless and went off again. Next morning the news was that a small shop had been broken into, one that had a post office counter in it. About £400 had been taken. The shopkeeper had been bound and gagged. The postmistress was beaten up and left unconscious. At about 7 that night they came in. Except for Ben, they were full of excitement and achievement. When they saw her, they exchanged glances, enjoying the secret she did not share. She saw them pull out wads of notes, fingering them, pushing them back into pockets. If she were the police, she would be suspicious on the strength of their elation, their hectic faces. Ben was not fevered like the others. He was as he always was. You could think he had not been part of whatever it was. But he had been there at the riot, she had seen him. She tried. I saw you lot on the television. You were at the Whitestone Estates. Oh yeah, we were there, boasted Billy. That was us, said Derek, giving himself thumbs-up approval, and Elvis looked sharp and knowing. Some others with them, who came sometimes, not regulars, looked pleased. A few days later, she remarked, I think you lot ought to know that this house is going to be sold, not at once, but quite soon. She was watching Ben particularly, but while he did turn his eyes on her, and she supposed took the news in, he said nothing. So you're going to sell, then, said Derek. She felt as much for politeness as for anything. She waited for Ben to mention it, but he did not. Was his identification with this gang of his now so great that he did not think of this as his home? She remarked to him, when he was out of earshot of the others, Ben, if for some reason you can't find me here, I'm going to give you an address where you can always reach me. As she spoke, she felt that David was watching her satirically, disapprovingly. All right, she said silently to the invisible David, but I know you would do the same if I didn't. that is the kind of person we are, and there's nothing we can do about it, for better or worse. Ben took the sheet of paper on which she had written her name, Harriet Lovett, care of Molly and Frederick Burke, and their Oxford address, which did give her a certain spiteful pleasure. But she found the sheet of paper lying forgotten or unregarded on the floor of his room, and did not try again. It was spring, then summer, and they came less often, sometimes not for days at a time. Derek had acquired a motorbike. Now, whenever she heard of a break-in, or a mugging, or a rape anywhere, she blamed them, but thought she was unjust. They could not be blamed for everything. Meanwhile, she was longing for them to leave. She was a ferment of need to start a new life. She wanted to be done with this unhappy house, and the thoughts that went with it. But they did come, sometimes. As if they had not been absent for so long, saying nothing about where, they would drift into the living room and sit themselves around the set, 4 or 5 of them, sometimes as many as 10 or 11. They did not now raid the refrigerator. There was very little in it these days. They brought in enormous quantities of a variety of foodstuffs that originated in a dozen countries. Pizzas and quiches, Chinese food and Indian, pita bread filled with salad, tacos, tortillas, samosas, chili con carne, pies and pasties and sandwiches. These were the conventional and hidebound English, were they? Not prepared to eat anything but what their parents knew. It did not seem to matter to them what they ate, provided there was a lot of it, and they might strew crumbs and crusts and cartons about, and not have to clean anything up. She tidied up after them and thought, it's not for long. She would sit by herself at the big table while they sprawled about on the other side of the low wall, and the television noises made a countercurrent to their loud, noisy, rancorous voices, the voices of an alienated, non-comprehending, hostile tribe. The expanse of the table soothed her. When first bought, as a discarded butcher's table, it had had a rough, much cut-about surface, but it had been planed down, and at that stage of its life had shown the clean creamy white of the new layer of wood. She and David had waxed it. Since then, thousands of hands, fingers, sleeves, the bare forearms of summer, the cheeks of children who had fallen forward asleep sitting on adults' laps, the plump feet of toddlers held up to walk there, everyone applauding, all this. The smoothings and caressings of 20 years had given the wide board it was all of a piece, cut long ago from some gigantic oak, a gleaming silken surface, so smooth fingers skated over it. Beneath the skin the knots and whorls lay submerged, their pattern known intimately to her. The skin had been scarred, though. Here was a brown half-circle where Dorothy had set down a too-hot saucepan and, angry with herself, had snatched it up. There was a curving black wheel, but Harriet could not remember what had made it. If you looked at the table from a certain angle, it had areas of tiny dimples or dents, where trivets had been set to keep the heat of dishes off the precious surface. When she leaned forward, she could see herself in the gleam dully, but enough to make her lean back again, out of sight. She looked like David, old. No one would say she was 45. But it was not the ordinary aging of gray hair. Tired skin, invisible substance had been leached from her. She had been drained of some ingredient that everyone took for granted, which was like a layer of fat but was not material. Leaning back where she could not see her blurry image, she imagined how, once, this table had been set for feasts and enjoyment, for family life. She recreated the scenes of 20, 15, 12, 10 years ago, the stages of the Lovett board, first David and herself, brave innocence, with his parents and Dorothy and her sisters, then the babies appearing and becoming small children. New babies, 20 people, 30, had crowded around this gleaming surface and been mirrored in it. They had added other tables to the ends, broadened it with planks set on trestles. She saw the table lengthen and widen, and the faces mass around. It always smiling faces, for this dream could not accommodate criticism or discord. And the babies, the children, she heard the laughter of small children, their voices, and then the wide shine of the table seemed to darken, and there was Ben, the alien, the destroyer. She turned her head cautiously, afraid to alert in him senses she was sure he possessed, and saw him there, in his chair. He sat apart from the others, always apart, and as always, his eyes were on others' faces, observing. Cold eyes? She had always thought them cold, but what did they see? Thoughtful? One could believe him thinking, taking in data from what he saw and arranging it, but according to inner patterns neither she nor anyone else could guess at. Compared with the raw and unfinished youths, he was a mature being. Finished. Complete. She felt she was looking, through him, at a race that reached its apex thousands and thousands of years before humanity, whatever that meant, took this stage. Did Ben's people live in caves underground while the Ice Age ground overhead, eating fish from dark subterranean rivers, or sneaking up into the bitter snow to snare a bear, or a bird, or even people, Harriet's, ancestors? Did his people rape the females of humanity's forebears, thus making new races, which had flourished and departed, but perhaps had left their seeds in the human matrix, here and there, to appear again, as Ben had? And perhaps Ben's genes were already in some fetus struggling to be born. Did he feel her eyes on him, as a human would? He sometimes looked at her while she looked at him, not often, but it did happen that his eyes met hers. She would put into her gaze these speculations, these queries, her need, her passion to know more about him, whom, after all, she had given birth to, had carried for 8 months, though it had nearly killed her, but he did not feel the questions she was asking. Indifferently, casually, he looked away again, and his eyes went to the faces of his mates, his followers. And saw what? Did he ever remember now that she, his mother, but what did that mean to him, had found him in that place and brought him home? Had found him a poor creature half dead in a straitjacket? Did he know that because she had brought him home, this house had emptied itself, and everyone had gone away, leaving her alone? Around and around and around, if I had let him die, then all of us, so many people, would have been happy, but I could not do it, and therefore. And what would happen to Ben now? He already knew about the half-derelict buildings, the caves and caverns and shelters of the big cities where people lived who could not find a place in ordinary homes and houses. He must do, for where else could he have been during the periods of days, or weeks, when he was gone from home? Soon, if he was often enough part of great crowds, part of the element looking for excitement in riots, street fights, he and his friends would be known to the police. He was not someone easily overlooked, yet why did she say that? Everyone in authority had not been seeing Ben ever since he was born. When she saw him on television in that crowd, he had worn a jacket with its collar up, and a scarf, and was like a younger brother, perhaps of Derek. He seemed a stout schoolboy. Had he put on those clothes to disguise himself? Did that mean that he knew how he looked? How did he see himself? Would people always refuse to see him, to recognize what he was? It would not, could not, be someone in authority, who would then have to take responsibility. No schoolteacher or doctor or specialist had been able to say, that is what he is, neither could any policeman or police doctor or social worker. But suppose one day someone who was an amateur of the human condition, perhaps an anthropologist of an unusual kind, actually saw Ben, let's say standing on a street with his mates, or in a police court, and admitted the truth. Admitted curiosity, what then? Could Ben, even now, end up sacrificed to science? What would they do with him? Carve him up? Examine those cudgel-like bones of his, those eyes, and find out why his speech was so thick and awkward? If this did not happen, and her experience with him until now said it was unlikely, then what she foresaw for him was even worse. The gang would continue to support themselves by theft, and sooner or later would be caught. Ben too. In police hands he would fight, and roar and stamp about and bellow, out of control with rage, and they would drug him, because they had to, and before very long he would be as he had been when she had found him dying, looking like a giant slug, pallid and limp in his cloth shroud. Or perhaps he could evade being caught. Was he clever enough? These mates of his gang, certainly were not, giving themselves away by their excitement, their elation. Harriet sat on there quietly, with the television sounds and their voices coming from next door, and she sometimes looked at Ben quickly, and then away, and she wondered how soon they would all simply go off, perhaps not knowing they would not return. She would sit there, beside the quiet soft shine of the pool that was the table, and wait for them to come back, but they would not come back. And why should they stay in this country? They could easily take off and disappear into any number of the world's great cities, join the underworld there, live off their wits. Perhaps quite soon, in the new house she would be living in alone with David, she would be looking at the box, and there, in a shot on the news of Berlin, Madrid, Los Angeles, Buenos Aires, she would see Ben, standing rather apart from the crowd, staring at the camera with his goblin eyes, or searching the faces in the crowd for another of his own kind.